They say history is written by the victors, but what about the forgotten? In the shadows of medieval castles and cathedrals, women endured lives shaped by superstition, control, and cruelty. From chastity belts to witch trials, their reality was often darker than any myth. What secrets did the scrolls leave out? Prepare to uncover the brutal, bizarre, and buried truths they never wanted you to hear. The birthing chair's agony. In medieval Europe, childbirth was perilous. Women gave birth on birthing chairs, designed to expose them to the gaze of midwives and sometimes male physicians. These chairs, often wooden with a hole in the seat, offered no comfort. Pain relief was scarce. Some women were given herbal concoctions, but many relied solely on prayer. Complications were common, and maternal mortality rates were high. The Church viewed childbirth pain as divine punishment for Eve's sin, discouraging interventions. Women who died in childbirth were often buried separately, their deaths seen as both tragic and tainted. The birthing chair symbolizes the intersection of medical ignorance and religious dogma that defined women's reproductive experiences in the Middle Ages. The Dowries Weight. Marriage in the Middle Ages was transactional. A woman's value was often tied to her dowry, a sum of money or property she brought to the marriage. Families negotiated marriages to forge alliances with little regard for the woman's wishes. If a dowry was insufficient, a woman might remain unmarried, facing social stigma. Widows could regain some autonomy, but were often pressured to remarry to secure family interests. In some cases, dowries were withheld or misused, leaving women vulnerable. The dowry system commodified women, reducing them to assets in familial strategies. This practice entrenched gender inequalities with long-lasting implications for women's rights and societal roles. The healer's fate. Women who practiced healing arts walked a fine line between respect and suspicion. Midwives and herbalists provided essential services, especially in rural areas. However, their knowledge, often passed down orally, was viewed with skepticism by the male-dominated medical establishment. Accusations of witchcraft were common, especially if a patient died under their care. The Church's stance against non-sanctioned healing practices led to trials and executions. Despite their contributions, these women were marginalized, their expertise dismissed or co-opted. The persecution of female healers reflects the broader fear of women's autonomy and the suppression of their roles in community health. The Anchorite Tomb. For some, holiness meant walls, thick, cold, eternal. The anchorite was bricked into a stone cell, often with a single window to the altar and a smaller slit to the outside. Once sealed in, she was considered dead to the world. Some chose this life, many didn't. Behind the silence, prayers were whispered into madness. They lived among rats, rot, and the smell of old bread, existing between sanctity and suffering. Julian of Norwich endured it. Others never wrote a word. Their names vanished with their final breath. Church records praised their devotion, but who recorded their despair? The anchorite lived in a paradox, entombed alive so she might save her soul. A willing martyr, or just another woman society had no other use for. The Maiden Tax. In some medieval cities, the mere fact of being a woman could carry a financial penalty. Maiden taxes, fees levied on unmarried women, were a quiet form of coercion. Officials framed it as civic duty, but beneath the bureaucracy was something sinister, a pressure to marry, to submit, to be counted under a man's household. Widows who resisted remarriage were targeted. Daughters without dowries became burdens on the books. In some cases, unmarried women were required to wear specific clothing or live in segregated housing. This wasn't tax policy, it was behavioral engineering. Marriage wasn't a choice, it was economic survival. Behind the ledgers and stamps, a darker truth lingered. Independence was something the system could not and would not afford women to have. The trial by water. When accusation met ambiguity, water made the decision. For women suspected of witchcraft or moral crimes, trial by water was the chosen ordeal. The logic was twisted. If she floated, she was guilty. Water, a pure element, rejected her impure soul. If she sank, she was innocent, but often drowned before rescue. Stripped and bound, women were cast into rivers, their fates decided by bubbles and superstition. Onlookers watched solemnly, sometimes cheering. This wasn't justice, It was ritualized torture disguised as divine will. The women knew the outcome didn't matter. Innocent or guilty, survival meant exile, execution, or social death. The river didn't cleanse them. It buried them deeper, in shame, in silence, in the cold logic of a world ruled by fear. The Sumptuary Laws. Sumptuary laws regulated clothing, aiming to maintain social hierarchies. Women were particularly targeted, with restrictions on fabrics, colors, and adornments. These laws dictated that only women of certain classes could wear specific garments, reinforcing class distinctions. Violations led to fines or public shaming. The laws also aimed to curb perceived moral decay, associating lavish dress with promiscuity. By controlling women's appearance, authorities exerted control over their behavior and status. These regulations exemplify how societal norms were enforced through legislation, limiting women's self-expression and reinforcing patriarchal structures. The curse of literacy. A woman with a book was a woman with suspicion. In many parts of medieval Europe, literacy among women was actively discouraged, especially outside convents. To read was to question, to write was to remember, and for authorities, both were threats. Some noble women learned to read psalters or devotional texts, but any woman fluent in Latin, especially outside the church, invited scrutiny. The act of reading could be mistaken for conjuring. Women were taught obedience, not knowledge, and knowledge, when pursued alone, became dangerous. Manuscripts were copied by hand. If a woman's handwriting was found in the margins, it could be considered evidence in witch trials. Literacy wasn't liberation. It was a loaded weapon, and the moment a woman picked up a quill, she risked her life for it. The forced veil. In some regions, especially under Christian canon law, widows and fallen women were forced to take the veil, literally and figuratively. Convents swelled with women who had no calling, only bad luck or family disgrace. For wealthy families, shipping off an inconvenient daughter to a nunnery was cheaper than a second dowry. And for the church, every veil was another soul contained, another mouth silenced. These veils weren't symbols of devotion, they were muzzles. Once veiled, a woman's name disappeared from public records. She could not own property. She could not remarry. She could not leave. Behind every silent nun's face may have been a woman who screamed once and was never allowed to again. The widow's trial. In theory, widowhood offered women a rare window of freedom in medieval society. In practice, it opened a door to suspicion. Widows owned land, wealth, and influence, until someone accused them of something: poisoning, witchcraft, seduction. Trials followed, often under the guise of moral inquiry. Some were forced to undergo humiliating examinations, others bribed or tortured. Without a husband to speak for her, a woman's word weighed less than a servant's whisper. In some towns, widows were expected to remarry quickly or face exile. If she remained alone too long, she was labeled a temptress or a crone. Widowhood wasn't freedom, it was a waiting game, with society circling, ready to drag her back into submission or oblivion. The Virgin Martyr obsession. In medieval art, hagiographies, and legend, the Virgin Martyr was the ideal woman, pure, passive, and preferably dead. Saints like Agnes, Lucy, and Cecilia were elevated precisely because they died, rather than marry, disobey, or lose chastity. Their pain was aestheticized, their suffering spiritualized. And for medieval women, these figures were both holy icons and haunting blueprints. The Virgin Martyr trope taught girls that resistance to sin meant obliteration of the self, that pain purified, that silence redeemed. But behind the stained glass halos, these stories reinforced a single truth: a woman's highest virtue was in being untouchable, even in death. Virginity wasn't just prized, it was weaponized. The midwife on trial. As medicine professionalized, women were pushed out. The midwife, once the cornerstone of community birth and death, became a target. By the 16th century, male physicians began monopolizing childbirth. Their strategy? Discredit the midwife. Accusations of witchcraft rose alongside medical licensing. Midwives were blamed for stillbirths, malformed children, and even infertility. In cities like Würzburg and Bamberg, entire networks of female healers were wiped out in trials. But the truth was simpler and more sinister. The male-dominated medical world saw midwives not as threats to children, but to power. Stripped of their roles, midwives were silenced. The knowledge of herbs, cycles, and touch, a legacy passed down through generations, vanished into ash and whispers. What was lost was more than tradition. It was a form of feminine resistance, burned alive. The bride auction. In 18th and 19th century England, poverty made women tradable. While not officially sanctioned, wife-selling became a desperate tradition. In market towns, husbands led their wives on leashes, literally to public squares, and auctioned them to other men. Crowds gathered, bidders jeered. Some women welcomed escape from abusive marriages. Others were humiliated, forced to smile, while strangers assessed their value. The state turned a blind eye, dismissing the practice as custom. For women, it was a grotesque parody of autonomy. Their fates hung in the air like cattle on the block. What was marriage then, if a woman could be bought twice? What is freedom, if it must be sold? The mourning dress. By the 19th century, women were expected to grieve in style. Widow's mourning became a ritual of control, cloaked in black silk. Queen Victoria popularized it after Albert's death, remaining in black for 40 years. But other women had no choice. Mourning dresses were mandatory for 1 to 2 years, often longer. No colors, no jewelry, no joy. A widow who broke protocol faced scandal. Some countries codified it into law. For aristocrats, the ritual was expensive. For the poor, oppressive. Many women entered mourning young and never left it. They became shadows of themselves. The dress didn't just mark loss, it enforced it, a visible reminder that a woman's identity died with her husband. And for many, it never returned. The trial of touch. In medieval Europe, some women accused of theft or adultery faced a trial not of logic, but of flesh. One common ordeal: carrying red-hot iron or plunging a hand into boiling water. If the wound festered, she was guilty. If it healed cleanly, she was innocent, though usually scarred for life. Women's bodies became battlefields of superstition. In some towns, a woman suspected of lying was forced to carry a glowing iron bar for several paces. No screams, no hesitation. The church called it God's judgment. But who did God listen to when every accused woman bled the same? These tests weren't about truth. They were about deterrence, dominance, and keeping women in line with divine fear stitched into their skin. The wet nurse bargain. Aristocratic women often handed their newborns to wet nurses. Poor women hired to breastfeed the elite's children. On the surface, it was practical. In truth, it was transactional and deeply unjust. Wet nurses were often forced to neglect their own infants or wean them early to serve wealthier families. Their milk became a commodity, their bodies regulated. Contracts sometimes forbade sex, dictated food, and even imposed penalties for insufficient milk production. And when an aristocratic child died under their care, punishment could be swift and fatal, regardless of cause. These women were essential and disposable. They gave life to another's bloodline while their own kin were left hungry, forgotten, or worse. The wet nurse wasn't a servant. She was a sacrifice. The Summa on wifely duties. In medieval scholastic circles, theology governed even the bedroom. One chilling example, Thomas Aquinas' interpretation of canon law in the Summa Theologica. Women, he argued, owed sex to their husbands as a marital debt, a debt they couldn't refuse. Refusal could be seen as sinful, even punishable under ecclesiastical law. The church taught that women's bodies were not their own, but a shared vessel. Consent was not a sacrament. It was presumed. Manuals instructed husbands on how to correct a disobedient wife. If he beat her reasonably, it wasn't abuse, it was discipline. These weren't fringe ideas. They shaped laws, sermons, and centuries of silence. Aquinas was canonized. His philosophy lives on in doctrine, but no one canonized the women who bled for it. The pilgrimage penance. For some women, sin wasn't punished with jail or lash. It was punished with exile. A common penance for adultery or moral failing was enforced pilgrimage. Women walked barefoot for miles in all seasons to distant shrines, alone, unguarded, and often starving. While men made pilgrimages to seek redemption, women were sent as punishment. In 14th century Spain and France, records show women being sentenced to pilgrimage for dancing, gossip, or dressing above their station. Some died en route. Others disappeared entirely. What was framed as spiritual cleansing was, in reality, social erasure, a way to remove the tainted woman from view. She was allowed to return, if she lived long enough. The monastic marriage fraud. In the 13th century, Europe faced a strange epidemic: secret marriages followed by forced convents. A man might privately marry a woman, often by mutual consent and a simple verbal vow. The next day, he'd vanish. Her family, now disgraced, might drag her to a monastery to hide the shame. But canon law accepted private vows as binding. So some women, now nuns, fought back. In court, they demanded recognition of their marriages. Some cases succeeded, many didn't. One woman in England famously escaped her convent 3 times, each time recaptured and sealed behind walls. Her crime? Trusting a man's promise. In the eyes of society, that was enough to condemn her to a lifetime of silence, prayer, and isolation. Love, in the Middle Ages, could be a sentence. The milk test of heresy. Inquisitors once believed the devil marked his servants, and sometimes his mark flowed with milk. During witch trials, women were stripped and searched for supernumerary nipples, a third teat said to nurse imps or demons. If one was found, even a mole, it was pierced or pricked. If no blood flowed or no pain was felt, the woman was condemned. In some trials, if a woman produced milk, natural for many nursing mothers, she was declared a consort of Satan. Women's bodies became cursed texts, and inquisitors their readers. It wasn't science, it wasn't even faith, it was fear, sharpened into procedure. And women, especially midwives and healers, were the first to bleed, or worse, fail to bleed. The widow's cloister. By the 13th century, certain Christian sects promoted the idea of the pious widow. These women, having lost their husbands, were expected to retire from the world, not just emotionally, but physically. In France, England, and parts of Germany, wealthy widows were sometimes pressured into reclusion, living in designated widow cloisters or enclosed religious homes, even against their will. It wasn't quite a convent, but it wasn't freedom either. They could keep their wealth, but not their lives. Their days were spent in regulated prayer, silence, and submission to clergy. Documents from Avignon and Cologne show families using this system to keep widowed matriarchs from remarrying, and thereby transferring property. It wasn't devotion, it was containment. The Feast of Fool's Queen. Once a year, madness ruled. In cathedrals and marketplaces across medieval France, the Feast of Fools flipped hierarchies. Drunken priests parodied mass, boys became bishops, and in some places, women became kings, or jesters, or goats. One tradition crowned a fool's queen. Often a poor or disabled woman paraded mockingly through the town. Her crown was paper, her throne a dung cart. It was all in jest, they said, but beneath the comedy was cruelty. These rituals were sanctioned inversions, a licensed hour of ridicule, and the woman at its center, a spectacle, part pagan scapegoat, part civic joke. The next day, order returned. Her crown was gone. But the mockery lingered, the sworn virgin of the mountains. In the Balkan highlands, a strange custom emerged, not in the Middle Ages, but rooted in old patriarchal law. When a family had no male heir, a daughter could become a sworn virgin. She would take a vow of chastity and live as a man, wearing male clothes, owning property, carrying weapons, respected, even feared. But at what cost? Her femininity erased, her body policed. Some chose this path for survival. Others were forced into it to protect family legacy. These women weren't rebels, they were reinforcements, pressed into male roles because patriarchy could bend itself but never break. A sworn virgin didn't escape the system. She became part of its machinery. The nun who escaped. In 1521, Katharina von Bora, a Cistercian nun in Saxony, climbed into a herring barrel to escape her convent. Her crime? Reading Luther's writings and desiring a life beyond celibacy and silence. She and 11 other nuns fled in secret, a scandalous act seen as heresy and rebellion. Katharina later married Martin Luther himself, becoming a public figure, housekeeper, estate manager, and mother. Her escape was not just physical, it was ideological, a rejection of enforced vows, gendered obedience, and economic control. But most nuns who tried to flee were not so lucky. Many were recaptured, punished, or killed. Katharina's story remains rare, a flash of resistance that broke through 1,000 walls of stone and prayer. The trial of the poisoner's spoon. In late medieval Europe, poisoning was considered a woman's crime. silent, domestic, intimate. Accusations often came not from evidence, but whispers. One ritual test, the poisoner's spoon. Suspected women were forced to ingest a bland stew from a communal ladle. If they choked, vomited, or trembled, signs of guilt, said the priests, they were arrested. The logic, only a guilty conscience could sour the stomach. In 15th century Florence and Paris, dozens of women were imprisoned or executed after neighbors reported sudden illnesses or deaths in their households. Some were servants, some were wives, trapped in loveless marriages. Few had actual poisons, but all had one thing in common: they cooked. The spoon, like the steak, was an instrument of judgment, and once it touched her lips, her fate was often sealed. The leper's wife. A leper in medieval Europe was cast out, but his wife, she was trapped in legal limbo. According to canon and civil codes, a woman whose husband became a leper was often required to remain celibate and loyal, even if he was exiled to a colony or cloister. Divorce was forbidden. Remarriage was a sin. Her identity was tied to a man who could no longer touch her, see her, or live among the living. In some cases, she was expected to deliver him food through a gate, recite prayers on his behalf, and wear veils of mourning. These women weren't widows, but they weren't wives either. The leper was cursed, but the wife, she was forgotten, alive but erased, lingering at the edge of society's ledger. The virginity inspection. Before marriage, some noblewomen, especially in 15th century Spain and Italy, were subject to brutal virginity examinations. Conducted by midwives, clerics, or older noblewomen, these tests involved physical probing, hymen inspection, or blood rituals. A sheet stained red after the wedding night wasn't romantic. It was legal proof. No blood, no dowry. In some cases, brides were publicly displayed for proof of chastity. The most horrific rituals occurred in courts where alliances hinged on a woman's purity, and if a bride failed, she could be disowned, annulled, or even executed. The obsession with virginity wasn't about biology, it was about control. Political, financial, spiritual. The bride was not a person. She was a guarantee. The womb of fire. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the church and state held a shared obsession, the female womb, as both sacred and dangerous. One result was the widespread belief in wandering womb theory, a concept that the uterus could move freely inside a woman's body, causing hysteria, madness, even death. The treatment? Fire. Literally. Midwives and physicians were instructed to apply heated herbs or smoke near the vulva to lure the womb back into place. The theory dated back to Hippocrates, but flourished in medieval Europe, especially in monastic medical texts. For many women, this meant enduring genital burns, smoke fumigations, and forced corrective sex. Madness wasn't treated with care, it was punished with ritual pain. These were not cures, they were cauterizations of autonomy, of womanhood, of sanity itself. The pilgrim whore tax. In bustling medieval pilgrimage towns like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela, sex work flourished, and so did regulation. But in some regions, female sex workers were taxed and licensed not for their safety, but for control. These taxes funded churches, public works, or even pilgrim hostels. In Avignon and certain German cities, the state mandated registration and branding, forcing women to wear special clothing or armbands marking their profession. Yet, clients, often pilgrims and clergy, faced no consequences. Records show that during feast seasons, women were arrested en masse to cleanse towns before holy events, their crime existing. Their bodies became battlegrounds for public morality and private vice. When the church preached virtue, it funded it with the wages of the condemned, sanctity and sin, financed by the same hand. The trial of the weeping wife. In some late medieval and early modern towns, public weeping was used as legal evidence. If a widow or wife showed too little sorrow at a husband's funeral, she could be investigated or even charged with complicity in his death. The reverse, if she wept too much, it might be performance. Inquisition-era France, Italy, and parts of the Habsburg Empire saw a rise in emotive trials, cases where women's tears, or lack thereof, were used to measure guilt. Behavior was pathologized. Eyewitnesses testified to facial expressions. In one infamous case in 1512 Spain, a woman was executed after 3 jurors agreed her mourning lacked conviction. No poison, no evidence, just dry eyes. rise. In these trials, women weren't judged for what they did, but for how convincingly they could suffer. History remembers kings and wars, but behind the thrones and beneath the banners were women trapped in rituals of pain, purity, and obedience. Their stories were written not in ink, but in scars, silences, and forgotten names. They were tested, traded, tamed, then erased. But the shadows they cast stretched long. In every courtroom echo, every ritual repeated, every policy cloaked in tradition, their ghosts remain. The Dark Ages were not just centuries past, they live where silence is still enforced. And now, their voices rise, not to beg, but to be heard, finally, fearlessly, and forever.